Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes hide behind the most ordinary faces. In the sterile halls of St. Mary's Medical Center, where arrogance wore white coats and experience was measured in years rather than wisdom, nobody expected that a quiet woman with calloused hands and tired eyes would become the bridge between life and death for America's most decorated warriors. What the doctors didn't know was that Maria Santos had already saved more lives than all of them combined. What they couldn't see beneath her simple scrubs was a Purple Heart recipient who had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles in the deserts of Afghanistan. What they refused to believe was that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in textbooks or prescription pads, but in the steady hands of someone who has looked death in the eye and refused to blink. This is the story of how laughter turned to respect, how judgment became gratitude, and how one woman's hidden past would save not just a life, but the soul of an entire hospital ward. Because when Navy SEAL Commander James Mitchell arrived at St. Mary's more dead than alive, carrying wounds that went far deeper than flesh, only one person in that building had the strength to pull him back from the darkness. The doctors thought they knew everything about healing. They were about to learn that sometimes the best medicine comes from the most unexpected places. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Medical Center cast harsh shadows across the pristine white floors as Maria Santos adjusted the stethoscope around her neck for the 100th time that morning. Her hands, weathered and scarred in ways that told stories she never shared, trembled slightly as she approached the nurse's station. At 42, she looked older than her years, her dark hair streaked with premature gray and her brown eyes holding depths that spoke of experiences far beyond the sterile walls of this suburban hospital. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, the head of the trauma unit, glanced up from his chart with the kind of dismissive look he reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. His perfectly styled silver hair and expensive suit spoke of privilege and prestige, the kind that came from decades of success in one of the country's most elite medical facilities. Behind him, a cluster of younger doctors snickered as they watched Maria fumble with the computer system, her fingers moving uncertainly across the keyboard. "Well," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being the smartest person in the room, "our new nurse seems to be having some technical difficulties." The words dripped with condescension, drawing more chuckles from his audience of residents and attending physicians. Perhaps community college didn't cover basic computer skills. Maria's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes focused on the screen. She had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, had performed emergency surgery in the back of a moving Humvee while under enemy fire, but somehow the casual cruelty of these privileged doctors felt like a different kind of battle entirely. One where her weapons of experience and skill seemed worthless against their armor of arrogance and assumption. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-featured woman in her 30s who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, joined the chorus of mockery. "I heard she came from some rural clinic in Nebraska," she said loudly enough for Maria to hear. "Probably thinks a trauma is when someone gets a splinter from their barn door." The laughter that followed was cruel and knowing, the kind that builds walls between people rather than bridges. What none of them knew was that Maria Santos had been Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Army 68W combat medic, veteran of 3 deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. They didn't know that she had earned her nursing degree through the GI Bill while working double shifts at a VA hospital, caring for wounded warriors who came home with injuries that went far beyond the physical. They couldn't see the Purple Heart medal hidden away in her small apartment, earned when she had thrown herself over a wounded soldier during a mortar attack, taking shrapnel in her back and shoulder to save his life. The computer finally cooperated, and Maria pulled up her first patient assignment. Room 314, post-operative appendectomy, routine monitoring. Simple enough, she thought, though she had learned long ago that nothing in medicine was ever truly simple. People were complex creatures, carrying invisible wounds alongside the visible ones. And healing required more than just following protocols and checking boxes. As she made her way down the corridor, Maria passed the break room, where she could hear Dr. Blackwell holding court with his usual audience of sycophants and students. His voice carried clearly through the partially open door, each word calculated to build his reputation at her expense. I don't understand why administration insists on hiring these charity cases, he was saying, the pause before charity cases loaded with meaning. This is St. Mary's, not some backwater clinic. Our patients expect a certain level of sophistication, a certain pedigree in their caregivers. Someone who understands that healing is as much art as science, requiring years of proper training and refinement. Dr. Walsh's voice joined in, equally dismissive. She probably learned everything she knows from some online course. You can always tell the difference between real medical professionals and these substitutes. It's in the way they carry themselves, the way they think. Some people are born for excellence, others. She let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Maria stopped walking, her hand tightening on the chart she carried. For a moment, she was back in a field hospital outside Kandahar, holding the hand of a 19-year-old soldier whose legs had been shattered by an IED. She had whispered prayers and promises to him while working frantically to stop the bleeding, her hands moving with a precision born of training and desperation. She had saved his life that day, and dozens of others, using skills that had nothing to do with prestige and everything to do with human connection and refusing to give up. But that was a different world, a different Maria. Here, she was just a new nurse who didn't fit their image of what competence looked like. Here, her experience meant nothing because it hadn't been earned in their approved institutions or validated by their accepted authorities. The patient in room 314 turned out to be Mrs. Eleanor Chun, an elderly woman who had been admitted for what should have been routine surgery, but was now experiencing complications that had the day shift nurses baffled. Her vital signs were unstable, her pain levels inconsistent with her medication schedule, and she seemed disoriented in a way that went beyond normal post-anesthetic confusion. Maria approached the bedside with the careful assessment skills that had been drilled into her through years of military training and refined through countless emergency situations. She didn't just look at the monitors and charts. She looked at Mrs. Chun herself, noting the subtle signs that spoke of distress beyond what the machines could measure. "Hello, Mrs. Chun," Maria said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to immediately settle the older woman's restless movements. "I'm Maria, your nurse for this shift. How are you feeling right now?" Mrs. Chin's eyes, cloudy with pain and confusion, focused on Maria's face with obvious relief. "The other nurses," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "they're so busy, so rushed. I tried to tell them something was wrong, but they just checked their computers and said everything looked normal." Maria pulled up a chair beside the bed, an action that went against the efficient protocols favored by the hospital, but felt right in her gut. She had learned long ago that healing often began with simply being present, with giving someone your full attention rather than treating them as a collection of symptoms to be managed. "Tell me what doesn't feel right," Maria said, taking Mrs. Chin's hand in both of hers. The older woman's skin was cool and clammy, her pulse rapid and thready in a way that spoke of something more serious than routine post-operative discomfort. As Mrs. Chun described her symptoms, Maria's mind began working through possibilities that went beyond the obvious. The abdominal pain wasn't localizing the way it should for a simple appendectomy recovery. The nausea was increasing rather than decreasing. Most concerning, there were subtle signs of internal bleeding that the monitoring equipment wasn't catching because they fell within the margins of what the computers considered normal. Maria excused herself and went to find Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the attending physician assigned to Mrs. Chen's case. Dr. Hernandez was younger than Blackwell and Walsh, recently out of residency, and still carrying some of the idealism that the hospital's culture hadn't yet completely crushed. She listened as Maria described her concerns, though her expression showed the automatic skepticism that came with years of medical training. "The monitors show her vitals are stable," Dr. Hernandez said, pulling up the electronic records on her tablet. "Her blood work from this morning was within normal ranges." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Maria chose her words carefully, knowing that her observations would be dismissed if she couldn't present them in the language these doctors understood. "I think she may be developing internal bleeding, possibly from a missed vessel or a suture that's come loose. Her pain presentation is inconsistent with normal healing, and there are subtle changes in her coloration and responsiveness that suggest developing shock." Dr. Hernandez frowned, clearly torn between her medical training and the hospital's implicit hierarchy that valued credentials over intuition. "That seems unlikely. Dr. Richardson performed the surgery, and he's one of our most experienced surgeons. The post-op notes show everything went perfectly." But something in Maria's calm certainty made the younger doctor hesitate. Perhaps it was the way Maria spoke with absolute conviction rather than the nervous deference most new nurses showed when questioning medical decisions. Perhaps it was the steady competence in her voice that spoke of experience beyond what her file suggested. "What would you recommend?" Dr. Hernandez asked, surprising herself with a question. "CT scan to rule out internal bleeding, updated blood work, including hemoglobin levels, and continuous monitoring rather than the routine checks," Maria replied without hesitation. "And if I'm right, she'll need to go back to surgery within the next few hours." Dr. Hernandez stared at Maria for a long moment, weighing the potential consequences of acting on the advice of a nurse with no apparent credentials against the possibility that she might be missing something serious. Finally, professional responsibility won out over institutional pride. "I'll order the tests," she said quietly. "But if you're wrong about this..." Maria nodded, understanding the unspoken threat. If she was wrong, her credibility would be destroyed before she had even established it. But if she was right and did nothing, Mrs. Chun could die from a preventable complication. It wasn't really a choice at all. The CT scan results came back 2 hours later, showing exactly what Maria had suspected. A small vessel had reopened, causing slow but steady internal bleeding that would have been fatal if left undetected. Mrs. Chun was rushed back to surgery, where Dr. Richardson repaired the problem with obvious embarrassment at having missed it the first time. Word of Maria's diagnostic success spread through the hospital with the speed that only gossip could achieve, but the reaction was not what she had hoped for. Instead of acknowledgement or respect, she found herself facing increased scrutiny and skepticism from the medical staff. Dr. Blackwell, in particular, seemed to take her success as a personal affront to his authority. "Lucky guess," he declared loudly in the doctor's lounge, making sure his voice carried to the hallway where Maria was passing. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." The danger of relying on instinct over science is that you start believing your own luck is actually skill. Dr. Walsh was more direct in her criticism. It's irresponsible to encourage nurses to second-guess medical decisions based on feelings rather than facts, she said during the next staff meeting. We have protocols and procedures for a reason. When people start thinking they know better than trained physicians, patients suffer. But Mrs. Chun didn't suffer. She recovered completely and was discharged 3 days later, stopping by the nurse's station to thank Maria personally for her care. The older woman's words were simple but heartfelt. You saved my life by actually seeing me, not just my chart. Maria smiled and accepted the thanks graciously, but inside she felt the familiar ache of being misunderstood and undervalued. She had faced enemy fire and life-or-death decisions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, but somehow navigating the politics and prejudices of a civilian hospital felt like an entirely different kind of war. As her first month at St. Mary's drew to a close, Maria had settled into a routine of quiet competence mixed with careful invisibility. She did her job well, perhaps too well, catching problems that others missed and providing care that went beyond the minimum requirements. But instead of earning respect, her success seemed to generate resentment from colleagues who saw her unconventional background as a threat to their carefully constructed hierarchy. The breaking point came on a quiet Tuesday evening when the emergency department received a call that would change everything. A military transport helicopter was en route, carrying casualties from a training accident at the nearby naval base. The patients were serious, the caller said, with multiple trauma injuries that would challenge even St. Mary's experienced emergency team. Dr. Blackwell took charge with his usual commanding presence, organizing the trauma teams and preparing the emergency department for what promised to be a long night. Maria was assigned to assist with whatever cases didn't require the most experienced hands, a position that clearly communicated where she stood in the hospital's hierarchy. The helicopter landed just after midnight, its rotors still spinning as paramedics rushed 3 stretchers through the emergency department doors. The first 2 patients were conscious and stable, suffering from broken bones and lacerations that, while serious, were well within the trauma team's capabilities. The third stretcher carried a different story entirely. The man lying there was barely breathing, his face pale beneath the oxygen mask, his body showing signs of injuries that went far beyond the obvious external trauma. The paramedic running alongside the stretcher was shouting vital signs and injury reports, but Maria could see in his eyes the look she recognized from too many battlefield evacuations, the look of someone who had done everything they could, but wasn't sure it would be enough. Navy SEAL Commander James Mitchell, the paramedic called out as they burst through the trauma bay doors. 34 years old, multiple trauma from helicopter crash during training exercise, possible internal bleeding, definite head trauma, and he's been unconscious for the past 20 minutes. Dr. Blackwell stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had handled thousands of emergency cases, but Maria could see something in Commander Mitchell's presentation that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just the obvious injuries or even the critical vital signs. It was something in a way he was breathing, the color of his skin, the subtle signs that spoke of damage that went deeper than what any scan or test could immediately reveal. As the medical team swarmed around the commander's bedside, Maria found herself moving closer despite her assigned position on the periphery. Something about this patient called to her in a way that had nothing to do with medical protocols and everything to do with the recognition that passes between warriors, even in the sterile environment of a civilian hospital. Commander Mitchell was dying, and she was the only person in that room who truly understood what that meant. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as Dr. Blackwell began barking orders to his team. Nurses scurried to connect monitoring equipment while residents prepared for lines and drew blood for emergency testing. The familiar symphony of a trauma response filled the air, but Maria could hear something wrong in the rhythm, a discord that spoke of missed details and overlooked clues. Commander Mitchell lay motionless on the gurney, his powerful frame somehow diminished by the severity of his injuries. Maria had seen enough wounded warriors to recognize the signs that others might miss. This wasn't just a man who had been hurt in an accident. This was someone whose body had been pushed beyond its limits long before the helicopter went down. The scars she could see on his exposed arms told stories of previous battles, previous wounds that had been patched up and ignored in service to duty and mission. Dr. Blackwell worked with practiced efficiency, ordering x-rays and blood work while examining the most obvious injuries. The commander had suffered multiple rib fractures, a dislocated shoulder, and various lacerations, but his vital signs suggested something more serious lurked beneath the surface. His blood pressure was dropping despite aggressive fluid resuscitation, and his oxygen saturation remained stubbornly low even with supplemental breathing support. Possible pneumothorax, Dr. Blackwell announced to his team, preparing to insert a chest tube. We need to decompress that lung and get his pressure stabilized. His movements were confident and precise, the actions of someone who had performed this procedure countless times before. But Maria saw something that made her step closer, her years of combat medicine screaming warnings that the rest of the team couldn't hear. The commander's breathing pattern wasn't consistent with a simple collapsed lung. The way his chest rose and fell, the subtle color changes in his extremities, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands all pointed to something that the standard trauma protocols weren't addressing. "Doctor," Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through the control chaos. "I think there might be something else going on." Dr. Blackwell paused in his preparation, his expression showing irritation at being interrupted by someone he considered far beneath his expertise. "Nurse Santos, I appreciate your concern, but this is a complex trauma case that requires specialized knowledge. Please assist Dr. Walsh with the blood work preparation." Maria felt the familiar weight of being dismissed, but Commander Mitchell's deteriorating condition overrode her concern about hospital politics. She had sworn an oath long ago to preserve life regardless of the personal cost, and that oath didn't end just because she no longer wore a military uniform. "Sir, I've seen similar presentations before," she persisted, her voice steady but urgent. The breathing pattern, the circulatory response, the way he's positioning himself unconsciously. I think he might have a cardiac contusion from the impact, possibly with developing tamponade. The trauma bay fell silent for a moment, the kind of pause that happens when someone says something so unexpected that it stops all other activity. Dr. Walsh looked up from the blood samples with obvious surprise, while the residents exchanged glances that clearly questioned whether the new nurse had completely lost her mind. Dr. Blackwell's face darkened with professional outrage. "Nurse Santos, cardiac tamponade is an extremely rare complication that requires extensive diagnostic testing to confirm. Your job is to follow orders, not to play doctor with guesswork based on whatever medical shows you might have watched." But Dr. Hernandez, who had been quietly observing from the corner after Maria's previous success with Mrs. Chun, stepped forward with cautious interest. "What makes you think cardiac tamponade?" she asked, ignoring the disapproving looks from her senior colleagues. Maria moved to Commander Mitchell's bedside, her hands hovering over his chest as she explained what she was seeing. "Look at his jugular veins. they're distended despite the blood loss. His heart sounds are muffled, and if you watch carefully, his blood pressure drops with inspiration. It's subtle, but it's there. The chest X-ray might not show it clearly because the fluid accumulation could be small at this point. Dr. Blackwell had heard enough. This is exactly the kind of dangerous thinking that happens when unqualified personnel start making medical diagnoses, he said loudly, clearly intending his words to be heard by everyone in the trauma bay. Cardiac tamponade is a life-threatening condition that requires immediate surgical intervention. We don't diagnose it based on nursing intuition. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. I understand your concerns, doctor, but what if we're missing something that could save his life? An echocardiogram would confirm or rule out tamponade in just a few minutes. Dr. Walsh had finished preparing the blood samples and now joined the conversation with obvious skepticism. Even if you were right, which is statistically unlikely, the echo machine is being serviced tonight. We'd have to call in the technician, which would take at least an hour. This patient needs immediate intervention for his obvious injuries, not delays based on unlikely theories. Commander Mitchell's vital signs continued to deteriorate as the debate continued around his bedside. His blood pressure dropped another 10 points, and his oxygen saturation began falling despite the chest tube that Dr. Blackwell had successfully placed. The standard interventions weren't working, and Maria could see the growing concern in the faces of the medical team, though none of them would admit that their diagnosis might be incomplete. Dr. Hernandez looked between Commander Mitchell's declining condition and Maria's steady conviction, weighing the potential consequences of both action and inaction. As the newest attending physician, she had less political capital to lose, but also less credibility to fall back on if she made the wrong choice. "I'll call for the echo tech," she said finally, her decision clearly surprising everyone in the trauma bay. "If we're wrong, we lose an hour. If we're right and do nothing, we lose a patient." Dr. Blackwell's expression showed pure professional outrage. "Dr. Hernandez, I strongly advise against letting nursing staff drive medical decision-making. This sets a dangerous precedent and undermines the authority structure that keeps our patients safe." But the echo technician arrived faster than expected, having been called back from dinner rather than from home. The portable ultrasound machine was wheeled into position, and within minutes the screen showed exactly what Maria had suspected: fluid around Commander Mitchell's heart, compressing the organ and preventing it from filling properly with each beat. The silence in the trauma bay was profound as the medical team stared at the undeniable evidence on the ultrasound screen. Commander Mitchell was indeed suffering from cardiac tamponade, a condition that would have been fatal within hours if left untreated. Maria had been right, and her intervention had quite literally saved his life. Dr. Blackwell recovered first, his professional training overriding his personal embarrassment as he began preparing for the emergency procedure needed to drain the fluid around the commander's heart. "We need to get him his surgery immediately," he announced, his voice carrying none of its usual arrogance. "Call the cardiac team and prep or 3. As the medical team mobilized for emergency surgery, Maria found herself standing alone beside the now empty trauma bay, her hands shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and vindication. She had been right again, but instead of feeling triumphant, she felt only the familiar weight of responsibility that came with carrying knowledge that others couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge. Dr. Hernandez approached her quietly as the chaos of emergency preparations continued around them. "How did you know?" she asked simply, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. That was an incredibly subtle presentation. Most physicians wouldn't have caught it, especially not that quickly. Maria looked toward the doors where Commander Mitchell had been wheeled away, her mind filled with memories of other warriors she had treated under far more primitive conditions. Experience, she said simply, not ready to reveal the full truth of her background to someone she barely knew. Sometimes you learn to see things that don't show up on tests or monitors. The surgery lasted 4 hours with Dr. Blackwell and the cardiac team working meticulously to repair the damage around Commander Mitchell's heart and address his other injuries. Maria waited in the surgical waiting area, not because hospital protocol required it, but because some indefinable connection to this patient kept her from simply going home at the end of her shift. When Dr. Blackwell finally emerged from surgery, his exhaustion was visible, but his expression was guarded. He spotted Maria immediately and approached with the careful bearing of someone who wasn't sure how to process what had happened earlier. "The commander is stable," he reported, his professional manner intact, but lacking its usual condescension. "The tamponade was significant, and you were right about the timing. Another hour or two, and we will have lost him." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally. "Your diagnostic skills tonight were impressive." Maria nodded quietly, accepting the grudging acknowledgement without satisfaction. Saving Commander Mitchell's life mattered more than any professional vindication, but she couldn't help wondering how many other patients might have been lost to the arrogance and assumption that seemed to poison the culture of this hospital. Over the next few days, as Commander Mitchell began his slow recovery, Maria found herself assigned to his case more frequently than chance would suggest. Dr. Hernandez, who had been watching Maria's work more carefully since the Trauma Bay incident, seemed to be deliberately pairing them together, creating opportunities for Maria to demonstrate her skills with a patient whose condition she understood better than anyone else on the floor. Commander Mitchell regained consciousness on the 3rd day after surgery, his eyes opening slowly to take in the unfamiliar surroundings of the cardiac intensive care unit. Maria was checking his vital signs when he first spoke, his voice rough with days of intubation and medication. "Where am I?" he asked, the question carrying an alertness that suggested his mental faculties had survived the trauma intact. "St. Mary's Medical Center," Maria replied, her voice gentle but professional. "You were in a helicopter accident during a training exercise. You've been unconscious for 3 days, but you're going to be fine." Commander Mitchell studied her face with a careful assessment of someone trained to read people and situations quickly. Maria could see him cataloging details, processing information, trying to piece together what had happened to bring him to this place. "You're not like the other nurses," he observed, his statement carrying no judgment, only curiosity. "Military?" Maria hesitated, surprised by his perceptiveness, but not entirely comfortable with the recognition. "Former," she said simply, hoping to deflect further questions. But Commander Mitchell's eyes showed understanding rather than mere curiosity. "Combat medic?" he guessed, and when Maria's slight nod confirmed his suspicion, he relaxed noticeably against his pillow. "Good. Means you've seen worse than this, and know what you're doing." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Blackwell, who entered the room with his usual commanding presence, but seemed surprised to find his patient awake and alert. The doctor's examination was thorough and professional, but Maria noticed how Commander Mitchell's responses changed subtly in the presence of the attending physician. The easy openness he had shown with her was replaced by the careful courtesy of someone dealing with a superior officer, respectful, but maintaining appropriate distance. "Your recovery is progressing well, Commander," Dr. Blackwell announced after completing his examination. "The cardiac surgery was successful, and your other injuries are healing normally. You should be able to return to duty within a few months, assuming you follow rehabilitation protocols carefully. Commander Mitchell thanked the doctor appropriately, but Maria could see something in his expression that suggested the conversation hadn't addressed his real concerns. After Dr. Blackwell left, the commander's demeanor shifted back to the more relaxed bearing he had shown with her earlier. "Doctor seems competent," he said carefully, clearly choosing his words to avoid direct criticism. "But he doesn't understand what returning to duty actually means, does he?" Maria understood immediately what he wasn't saying. Dr. Blackwell saw injuries and recovery in purely medical terms as problems to be fixed and returned to normal function. He couldn't comprehend the psychological and emotional complexity of a warrior who had been broken and rebuilt, who would carry the memory of vulnerability and mortality back into a profession that demanded absolute confidence and trust. No, Maria replied honestly. He doesn't understand that some wounds don't show up on X-rays or blood tests. Commander Mitchell's eyes showed recognition and perhaps relief at finding someone who understood the deeper implications of what he had experienced. They talked quietly for the next few minutes, not about medical procedures or recovery timelines, but about the challenge of maintaining identity and purpose when your body has betrayed your mind's expectations of invincibility. Their conversation revealed layers of connection that went beyond their shared military background. Commander Mitchell had led teams in some of the same regions where Maria had served, though at different times and in different capacities. They knew the same dangers, understood the same sacrifices, and carried similar invisible wounds from experiences that civilian medical professionals couldn't fully comprehend. As Maria's shift ended and she prepared to leave, Commander Mitchell called her back to his bedside. "Thank you," he said simply, but his words carried weight that went beyond gratitude for professional nursing care. Not just for the medical stuff, but for seeing me as more than just another patient. Maria nodded, understanding that acknowledgement was perhaps the rarest gift that warriors could give each other. But she also knew that their connection, however meaningful, existed within the broader context of a hospital culture that still viewed her as an outsider whose contributions were tolerated rather than valued. The next few days brought subtle changes in how some of the medical staff interacted with Maria. Dr. Hernandez had clearly spoken to others about Maria's diagnostic success with Commander Mitchell, and a few of the more junior physicians began asking her opinion on difficult cases. But the hospital's established hierarchy remained largely unchanged, with Dr. Blackwell and his circle of senior staff maintaining their attitude of professional superiority. The real test came when Commander Mitchell developed complications that threatened to undo all the progress he had made since surgery. His recovery had been proceeding normally until the 5th day, when he began showing signs of depression and withdrawal that went far beyond normal post-surgical emotional responses. He stopped participating in physical therapy, refused to engage with visitors from his unit, and seemed to be retreating into a psychological space that Maria recognized, but that the hospital's standard psychiatric consultation couldn't effectively address. Dr. Blackwell ordered antidepressant medications and counseling sessions, treating the commander's condition as a straightforward case of adjustment disorder. But Maria could see that something deeper and more complex was happening, something that required understanding the warrior's mindset rather than simply applying civilian psychological frameworks. The breaking point came when Commander Mitchell refused to get out of bed for his scheduled physical therapy session, an act of noncompliance that threatened both his physical recovery and his standing with his military command. The physical therapist reported the incident to Dr. Blackwell, who responded with frustration and threats of disciplinary action that only made the situation worse. Maria found Commander Mitchell staring out his window that afternoon, his expression empty in a way that she had seen too many times before in wounded warriors who had lost their connection to purpose and identity. She pulled up a chair beside his bed, not speaking immediately, but simply being present in the way that military medics learned to do with patients whose wounds went deeper than flesh. "You're not broken," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked similar paths. "You're just remembering what it feels like to be human instead of invincible." Commander Mitchell turned from the window to look at her, his eyes showing pain that had nothing to do with physical injuries. "How do you go back to leading men into danger when you know how easily it can all fall apart?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of command responsibility and personal vulnerability. Maria understood that this conversation would determine not just Commander Mitchell's recovery, but her own standing within the hospital community. She could play it safe, offer the kind of generic encouragement that civilian healthcare providers typically gave to struggling patients. Or she could draw on her own experience and knowledge to provide the kind of healing that went beyond medical protocols. She chose truth over safety, connection over protocol, and in doing so, set in motion events that would transform not just one patient's life, but the entire culture of St. Mary's Medical Center. Maria looked into Commander Mitchell's eyes and saw the same haunted expression she had carried for months after her own medical discharge from the Army. The weight of watching strong men fall, of making life and death decisions in impossible circumstances, of carrying responsibility for others' lives while questioning your own worth. She had been where he was now, lost in the space between warrior and civilian, between invincible and vulnerable. "You don't go back the same," she said quietly, her words carrying the wisdom of someone who had walked through that particular darkness and found a way out. "But you go back stronger because now you know what you're really fighting for. Not the mission or the medals or the glory, but the people who trust you to bring them home." Commander Mitchell studied her face with new attention, seeing perhaps for the first time the depth of experience behind her quiet demeanor. "You were command," he said, "not a question, but a recognition. You had people depending on you." Maria nodded slowly, remembering faces and names that still visited her dreams. Platoon medic, attached to different units, depending on where the need was greatest. "I kept 37 soldiers alive through 3 deployments, pulled them out of situations where the odds said they shouldn't have survived." She paused, her voice growing softer. "Lost 4, still carry their names." The silence that followed was comfortable in a way that only exists between people who share certain kinds of knowledge. Commander Mitchell shifted in his bed, his posture straightening slightly as if remembering who he was beneath the patient gown and hospital bracelet. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep going when you know that everything you've built your identity on can be taken away in a heartbeat?" Maria smiled, the expression carrying both sadness and hope. "You rebuild on something deeper. When I first got out, I thought my value came from being a soldier, from being tough and invincible and needed. Took me 2 years and a lot of therapy to understand that my real strength came from caring about people, from being willing to put their well-being before my own comfort." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Blackwell, who entered with obvious frustration written across his features. Behind him followed Dr. Walsh and 2 residents, creating the kind of medical parade that usually signaled either very good news or very bad news. "Commander Mitchell," Dr. Blackwell began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used when delivering ultimatums. Your refusal to participate in prescribed physical therapy is jeopardizing your recovery and creating liability issues for this hospital. If you continue to be non-compliant, we'll have no choice but to refer your case to military medical authorities for disciplinary action. Maria watched Commander Mitchell's expression close off, saw him retreat behind the professional mask that military personnel learned to wear when dealing with civilian authority figures who didn't understand the complexity of their situation. The progress they had just made in their conversation evaporated as he returned to the defensive posture of a patient being managed rather than a person being healed. "Understand, doctor," Commander Mitchell replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "I'll comply with the therapy schedule." But Maria could see that compliance wasn't the same as healing, that forcing participation without addressing the underlying issues would only create the appearance of recovery while leaving the deeper wounds untreated. She had seen too many warriors pushed through medical processes that fixed their bodies while ignoring their souls, sent back to duty carrying invisible damage that eventually destroyed them from within. "Doctor," Maria said, stepping forward despite the obvious disapproval in DR. Blackwell's expression. "Could I speak with you privately about Commander Mitchell's care plan?" Dr. Blackwell's eyebrows rose in surprise and irritation. "Nurse Santos, patient care decisions are made by physicians based on medical expertise and established protocols. While we appreciate nursing input on certain practical matters, treatment planning is not within your scope of practice." Maria felt the familiar surge of frustration that came with being dismissed before she could even present her perspective, but Commander Mitchell's deteriorating condition overrode her concern about professional consequences. "Sir, I believe there are aspects of his condition that standard protocols aren't addressing effectively." Dr. Walsh stepped forward with obvious impatience. "This is exactly what we discussed before, the dangerous tendency for support staff to overstep their boundaries. Commander Mitchell needs medical treatment, not amateur psychology from someone who thinks military background qualifies them to practice medicine." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. Maria wasn't a physician, didn't have the credentials or authority to challenge medical decisions in any formal way. But she also knew that Commander Mitchell was slipping away from them, retreating into a psychological space where medical interventions alone couldn't reach him. "I'm not trying to practice medicine," Maria said carefully, choosing her words to avoid giving them ammunition against her. "I'm suggesting that his resistance to treatment might be addressed more effectively if we understood the underlying concerns driving his behavior." Dr. Blackwell looked at his watch with obvious impatience. "Nurse Santos, we have other patients to attend to. Commander Mitchell will either comply with his treatment plan or face the consequences of his choices. Sometimes the kindest approach is to let adults take responsibility for their own recovery." As the medical team filed out of the room, Maria felt the weight of professional isolation settling over her once again. She had the knowledge and experience to help Commander Mitchell, but the institutional barriers prevented her from applying that knowledge in any meaningful way. The hospital's rigid hierarchy valued credentials over competence, protocol over intuition, and compliance over genuine healing. Commander Mitchell waited until the doctors were gone before speaking. "Don't," he said quietly, his voice carrying both warning and concern. "Don't sacrifice your career here trying to fix something that can't be fixed. I've seen what happens when good people go up against systems that don't want to change." But Maria had already made her decision, the same choice she had made countless times in combat zones when following orders would have meant letting someone die. "Some things matter more than careers," she replied, pulling out her phone to make a call that would either vindicate her approach earned her tenure at St. Mary's. The call was to Master Sergeant William Hayes, a retired Army medic who now worked as a patient advocate specializing in military personnel transitioning through civilian healthcare systems. Maria had met him during her own medical discharge process, and he had helped her navigate the complex bureaucracy of veterans' benefits and civilian medical care. Sergeant Hayes arrived at the hospital within 2 hours, his presence immediately changing the dynamic in Commander Mitchell's room. He was a large man in his 50s, his civilian clothes unable to completely disguise the military bearing that marked him as someone who had served in positions of authority and responsibility. "Commander," Hayes said, approaching the bedside with the easy familiarity of someone who understood military protocol and culture. "Heard you might need someone who speaks the language to help translate between what the doctors are saying and what you actually need." The change in Commander Mitchell was immediate and visible. His posture straightened, his voice regained its natural authority, and his eyes showed engagement for the first time in days. Here was someone who understood the complexity of a situation, who could bridge the gap between warrior identity and patient vulnerability. Dr. Blackwell appeared within minutes of Hayes' arrival, clearly having been alerted by nursing staff that an unauthorized visitor was conducting what appeared to be therapy sessions with a patient. His expression showed the territorial concern that medical professionals displayed when outsiders encroached on their domain. "Excuse me," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice carrying diplomatic courtesy layered over institutional authority, "but patient visits must be cleared through appropriate channels. Are you family?" Hayes smiled with the patience of someone who had navigated similar bureaucratic challenges many times before. "Master Sergeant William Hayes, retired, currently working as a patient advocate through the Veterans Administration. I'm here at the request of Commander Mitchell's chain of command to ensure he receives appropriate support during his recovery process." The mention of official military involvement shifted the conversation's tone immediately. Dr. Blackwell's expression showed he was calculating the potential political and administrative consequences of interfering with military personnel conducting official business. "Of course," Dr. Blackwell replied carefully. "We appreciate military support for our service members. However, all treatment decisions must still follow hospital protocols and medical best practices." Hayes nodded agreeably. "Absolutely, Doctor. My role is purely supportive, helping Commander Mitchell understand his options and ensuring that his recovery process addresses both his medical needs and his professional obligations." Over the next hour, Hayes worked with Commander Mitchell to develop a comprehensive rehabilitation plan that addressed not just his physical injuries, but the psychological challenges of returning to active duty after experiencing vulnerability and mortality. The approach combined standard medical therapy with military-specific counseling techniques that acknowledged the unique pressures and responsibilities of command positions. Maria watched the interaction with professional fascination and personal vindication. This was exactly the kind of holistic approach she had been trying to suggest, the recognition that healing sometimes required understanding the person beneath the patient. Hayes was accomplishing what she couldn't because he had the credentials and authority to operate within the system rather than challenging it from outside. The transformation in Commander Mitchell's condition over the following days was remarkable. His compliance with physical therapy improved dramatically when the exercises were framed in terms of mission readiness rather than medical necessity. His depression began lifting when his concerns about leadership responsibility were addressed directly rather than dismissed as adjustment disorders. Most importantly, he began engaging with the hospital staff as a partner in his recovery rather than a reluctant victim of medical procedures. The change created positive feedback loops that improved not just his condition, but the entire atmosphere of his care team. Dr. Hernandez was the first to acknowledge what had happened. She pulled Maria aside during a quiet moment and spoke with obvious admiration. Whatever you did to arrange that intervention saved that man's career and possibly his life. That was exceptional patient advocacy. But it was Dr. Blackwell's reaction that surprised Maria most. Rather than anger or professional jealousy, he seemed genuinely curious about the approach that had succeeded where traditional medical intervention had failed. "Nurse Santos," he said, approaching her during a break in his rounds, "I'd like to understand better how you knew what Commander Mitchell needed. Your assessment of his condition was more accurate than our psychiatric consultation." Maria looked at him carefully, trying to read whether this was genuine interest or some kind of professional trap. "Experience with similar cases," she said cautiously. "Military personnel often have concerns that don't fit standard civilian healthcare models." Dr. Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to present your approach at our next department meeting? It might be valuable for other staff to understand how to better serve military patients." The invitation was unexpected and significant. Department presentations were typically reserved for physicians and senior staff, not nurses who had been working at the hospital for less than 2 months. It represented a level of professional recognition that Maria had not dared to hope for. The presentation took place the following week in the hospital's main conference room, attended by the entire medical staff along with administrators and department heads. Maria had prepared carefully, focusing on evidence-based approaches to military health care rather than personal anecdotes that might seem self-serving. She explained the unique psychological pressures faced by military personnel, the importance of understanding warrior culture in developing effective treatment plans, and specific techniques for building trust with patients who were trained to be suspicious of civilian authority. Her presentation was professional and practical, avoiding criticism of existing protocols while offering concrete suggestions for improvement. The response was better than she had dared hope. Dr. Hernandez asked thoughtful questions about implementing similar approaches with other challenging cases. Several residents took notes and requested additional resources for understanding military culture. Even Dr. Walsh, who had been among Maria's harshest critics, acknowledged that the information would be valuable for their emergency department. But it was the response from hospital administration that truly changed Maria's situation at St. Mary's. Director Patricia Wells, who had been observing quietly from the back of the room, approached Maria after the presentation with obvious interest. "Ms. Santos," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who made significant decisions about hospital operations, "we've been discussing the need for specialized programs to better serve our military patient population. Your presentation suggests you might be exactly the kind of person we need to develop those programs." The offer that followed was beyond anything Maria had imagined when she first walked through St. Mary's doors as a dismissed new nurse. Director Wells proposed creating a new position specifically for her, military liaison nurse, responsible for developing protocols for military patient care, training staff on military culture issues, and serving as advocate for service members navigating civilian health care. The position came with increased responsibility, better pay, and, most importantly, the authority to implement the kinds of changes that could prevent other military patients from falling through the cracks of a system that didn't understand their needs. Commander Mitchell was discharged 2 weeks later, his recovery complete, and his return to active duty approved by both military and civilian medical authorities. On his last day, he stopped by Maria's new office to thank her one final time. "You saved more than my life," he said, his voice carrying the sincerity that marked genuine gratitude. You showed me that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And being human doesn't disqualify you from leadership, it makes you a better leader." 3 months later, Maria received a package addressed to her office at St. Mary's Medical Center. Inside was a framed certificate from the U.S. Navy, officially recognizing her contribution to the care and recovery of Commander James Mitchell. But it was the accompanying letter that truly moved her. The letter was signed by Admiral Patricia Richardson, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and it read in part, "Your exceptional care and advocacy for Commander Mitchell exemplifies the highest standards of military medical support. Your actions prevented the loss of an exceptional officer and demonstrated the kind of courage and selflessness that honors all who have served." But perhaps more importantly, the letter continued, "Based on Commander Mitchell's recommendation and our investigation of her military service record, it is my honor to inform you that you have been nominated for the Navy Cross, the highest decoration available to non-Navy personnel, in recognition of your extraordinary heroism in combat operations during your deployments to Afghanistan." Maria sat in her office reading the letter for the third time, her hands shaking slightly as the full implications settled in. The Purple Heart citation had been buried in bureaucratic files when she was medically discharged, never properly processed or presented. Her combat record had been lost in the transition between military and civilian life, her service record incomplete and unrecognized. Commander Mitchell had not only recovered from his injuries, he had taken the time to research her background and ensure that her military service received the recognition it deserved. More than that, he had used his influence to create opportunities for her expertise to be valued and utilized. The ceremony took place 6 months later in the hospital's main auditorium, attended by military personnel, hospital staff, and members of the local veteran community. Admiral Richardson herself presented the awards, speaking eloquently about the importance of recognizing service that often went unacknowledged. As Maria stood at attention receiving the medal she had earned but never expected to see, she looked out at the audience and saw faces that told the story of her journey. Dr. Blackwell sat in the front row, his expression showing genuine respect and perhaps some embarrassment at how wrong his initial assessment had been. Dr. Hernandez beamed with pride, having become not just a colleague, but a friend who valued Maria's expertise. But it was Commander Mitchell's presence that meant the most. He sat with other military personnel, his dress uniform pristine and his posture straight, but his eyes showed the warmth of someone who understood exactly what this moment represented. After the ceremony, as Maria accepted congratulations and posed for photographs, Commander Mitchell approached her with something in his hand. It was a small wooden plaque with words carved in simple script. Sometimes the most powerful medicine comes from the most unexpected places. "For your office," he said simply. "So you remember that saving lives isn't about credentials or protocols or impressing colleagues. It's about being willing to see people as more than their diagnoses and care enough to fight for what they need, even when nobody believes you." Maria looked around the auditorium at the gathered crowd, at the hospital staff who had once dismissed her as unqualified, at the military personnel who now saw her as a bridge between two worlds that often failed to understand each other. The journey from laughed-at new nurse to respected military liaison had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had led to something more valuable than professional success. It had led to the understanding that true healing requires more than medical knowledge. It requires the courage to see beyond appearances, to challenge assumptions, and to fight for patients when fighting for them means risking everything you've worked to build. Dr. Blackwell approached her as the crowd began to disperse, his expression showing the humility that sometimes comes with genuine learning. "Maria," he said, using her first name for the first time since she had started at St. Mary's, "I owe you an apology. When you first arrived here, I saw someone who didn't fit my idea of what competence looked like. I was wrong, and my prejudice nearly cost us the opportunity to learn from someone with extraordinary experience and wisdom." Maria accepted his apology graciously, understanding that changing institutional culture was a gradual process that required both confrontation and forgiveness. "We all have biases, Doctor. The important thing is being willing to question them when evidence suggests they might be wrong." As she drove home that evening, Maria reflected on the events that had brought her to this point. The young woman who had enlisted in the Army straight out of high school had been motivated by patriotism and adventure, seeking purpose in serving something greater than herself. The combat medic who had saved lives in some of the world's most dangerous places had been driven by duty and loyalty to her fellow soldiers. But the nurse who had fought for Commander Mitchell and transformed the culture at St. Mary's had been motivated by something deeper. The understanding that healing is not a technical skill, but a human connection, requiring courage, empathy, and the willingness to see each person as more than the sum of their symptoms or circumstances. The doctors had laughed at the new nurse because they couldn't see past their own assumptions about what expertise looked like. But in the end, it wasn't Maria's credentials that saved Commander Mitchell's life or changed the hospital's approach to military patients. It was her willingness to recognize that some of the most important knowledge comes not from textbooks or lectures, but from the school of human experience where the tuition is paid in pain and the graduation certificate is written in the lives you managed to save. The wounded SEAL commander had honored her not because she was extraordinary, but because she had been willing to be fully human in a professional environment that often valued technical competence over human connection. In doing so, she had shown everyone around her that the most powerful medicine indeed comes from the most unexpected places, from the hands of someone who has known suffering and chose compassion, from the heart of someone who has experienced powerlessness and chose to empower others, from the soul of someone who has faced death and chose to dedicate their life to healing.